Okay, we're gonna get rolling. I'm super excited to be here. And thank you, Wanakee Public Library, for caring and creating community and opportunities for us all to come together. It's really wonderful, and to find innovative ways for us to come together. So tonight we are here for an hour and 15 minutes, 75 minutes, and we're going to be talking about race, whiteness, talking to our kids, etc. So I do have a PowerPoint, but this is meant to be very interactive. Part of it is to practice and to start learning how to practice, which means coming out from behind and stepping into what can be uncomfortable. I like to acknowledge the fact that I am asking for people to be uncomfortable and to experience discomfort in some of the conversations that we have. And also, you know yourself best. So you know when you need to take a break or don't, want to step away or don't want to engage. So I'm trusting you to monitor where your comfort edge is, where your growing edge is, and take notice of that, because that's a lot of the work that we're going to be doing. Here we go. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to jump in. So the way this works in terms of this interactive group thing is that I can't see all of your faces all of the time, and I'm not really able to, sometimes I get distracted by the chat, so it's better for me not to have the chat on. So Brittany, if you do notice some things with the chat that come up, feel free to interrupt me. That's easier for me than trying to manage looking at the chat. But the chat is really helpful. Like if you want me to slow down or if you want me to repeat something, please feel free to use the chat to engage. Or I think there's a way you can raise your hand too. But just know that if I'm not responding, it's because I can't see you. So don't hesitate to take yourself off mute and jump right in. Okay. This is me and my family and my super cute dog Pumbaa. So I am Sara Alvarado. I am a white woman, and I am an extrovert. I'm a rebel. I'm trying to move this thing so I can see my screen. I'm a rebel rouser. I'm a business owner. I'm part of a multicultural family. I identify cisgender, she, hers, and I am Jewish, Catholic, and super spiritual. That's my husband, Carlos, who is Mexican, and we have two boys, Alex and Leo, 19 and 15, almost 16. So tonight, what to expect? We're going to talk about some hard things. We're going to talk about why it's hard, where we stand, and how. We're going to go through some conversation tips and tricks and understanding the process, and then talking about what's next. And one of the things that I think is really important is to acknowledge that there is no pretty bow for any of this, right? Like, we don't have all the answers, and if it were simple, we wouldn't be here right now, because it's 2020. And so if this were something that, and when I talk about this being something, I'm talking about racism. I'm talking about the fact that people are being killed because of the color of their skin, that there are disparities in every single area, whether it's education, healthcare, criminal justice, and it's based on our racial makeup. And there's a lot of racism in the United States of America. So that is where I'm coming from. I'm not coming into this with a discussion on if that's even a thing or not, because we see it on a regular basis. And I think the reason that a lot of you are here is because you want to do something about it. And part of it is, how do we engage in conversations? So that is one aspect to it, but there's lots of other aspects to it. And the fact that it can be messy, and it needs to be messy when we are in a culture of perfectionism and making sure that everything looks good and sounds good. And so that is a disconnect. And that's one of the reasons that it is slightly challenging. Most of the people here, I can't see a lot of the people here actually, but I am guessing that a lot of the people here are white women. And if you are not a white, or you don't identify as a white woman, please know that my perspective as a white woman limits me. And so some of the work that I do is on understanding that, but that's my lens. I am very much a white woman, and most of what I'm talking about and the people that I'm talking to in this 75 minutes are white women. So this can be taken in different areas, but I think it's important to acknowledge the identity and the lens that I have. So what I say and see can be different depending on different lenses. One of the reasons that white women have this unique perspective or the unique position is because we are the oppressed and the oppressor. I know from speaking with a lot of white women that one of the challenges in terms of speaking out is not wanting to do it wrong and not wanting to say the wrong thing, and not wanting to hurt someone. So if I'm going to say the wrong thing, it could cause harm. I don't want to cause harm, so I will just be quiet. And silence is actually a message. We're delivering messages when we stay silent, and silence is very harmful. So to get through that perspective of how to speak, when to speak versus being silent, part of the reason why it's this unique position is that as gender oppression impacts us, we completely get it. Like, we know what it's like to be oppressed. We know what it's like to be in a situation where we're shushed or we're dismissed, and we know what it's like to not maybe get a job or a promotion based on our gender, to not be seen as strong, or to maybe be seen as too weak because of our tears, like whatever. Like, there's so many ways that we experience oppression. And so to acknowledge the fact that we are an oppressor has a different aspect to it that can be incredibly painful, because we know what it feels like. So then to have to look in the mirror and be like, oh my gosh, my whiteness is oppressive, and I don't even know how to make sense of that. Partly because we weren't raised to talk about it, for the most part. We really weren't. So that's one of my questions to you is, growing up, how often did you talk about race at your dinner table with your family? And I'm gonna actually ask you that. Can you see that poll in progress? Yes, okay, so people are jumping in. There's a lot of nevers, very rarely, once in a while. Ooh, there's an on a regular basis. So that's an unusual one. I know for me, I did not grow up talking about race a lot. And I will tell that story in a little bit. Okay, thank you all. There's mostly nevers and very rarelys, and there's some every once in a while. I think I can share those. Okay, but I want to ask you another question, but I don't know how. Okay, yeah, oh, there it is, poll 2. This one is, how often do you talk about race with family and friends now? Okay, so can you see this? The majority is every once in a while, often, and on a regular basis. So you see a shift. We see a shift generation to generation. And that's got to give us some hope. I'm going to tell you about the day that I committed. I think everyone has to come to a day where they commit to becoming anti-racist. And the difference when I talk about being anti-racist versus non-racist is, as a non-racist, or as someone that says, oh, I don't, I don't treat anyone differently. I believe everybody should have equal treatment, and I'm a good person. So this is in the non-racist category. And whereas anti-racist is acknowledging that we do all swim in racist systems, and then the gap is that we use our voice and we take action consistently in anti-racism work. Whereas if we're not using our voice and consistently doing the work, then we are in this non-racist world, which can even be the complicity and the silence. So just a little bit about my story, since I know a lot of you here have children. The reason that I got into this work in 2013 is 100% has to do with raising children. So as you notice, my husband is Mexican, and I was raised by a white Catholic raised father and a white Jewish mother. And they were hippies. My middle name is Lilac. So I was raised with this concept that we could love anybody. It was really hard for them to get married with their Jewish family and Catholic family. They broke some barriers with that and made some people upset. And they really wanted me to know that I could fall in love and marry anyone. It didn't matter gender, it didn't matter sexual orientation, it didn't matter race, ethnicity, language, whatever. And this is what it means to be raised colorblind. So we're all the same. We're all the same inside, and racism is over, and this is a beautiful new world. So growing up, that was really great to some extent, except that I didn't understand that we're not all treated differently. So yes, we're all the same on the inside, but we're not all treated the same based on our skin color. And not understanding that and having those conversations, I didn't see my own whiteness, and I didn't understand my own privilege. And I traveled a lot, and I did love lots of different people, and I ended up falling in love with my husband in Mexico, and we moved back to Madison, or we moved to Madison in 2002, and we started raising children, or 2 boys. And when Alex was 12, he was a soccer player, the Race to Equity report had just come out. So it was September of 2013. And I went to a presentation. I don't know if you know of the Race to Equity report. It's this report that came out in 2013 that showed the disparities between Black and white families in all of the different areas of health care, mass incarceration, education, economic disparities, et cetera. And the disparities are huge. And it was Dane County compared to Wisconsin compared to the United States. So like showing how horrible Dane County specifically was. So this presentation was, I saw it at like it was like a women's luncheon or something. It was on a Tuesday. And I remember sitting there and I was like, no way, not in Madison. So this is me being super naive and white. Like we're very engaged in the Latino Hispanic community in Madison. But the Black and white disparities, I was not aware that they were that bad. So I was like, oh my gosh, Madison, but it's so diverse and yada, yada, yada. And I felt like, ooh, we have to do something about this. And at the last slide, I was super irritated because on the last slide, it said something like, there were 3 things that people could do next. And one of them was talk to family and friends about race more. And I was like, how do you do that? Like, okay, sure. I don't know what you mean, because I just wasn't something that we talked about a lot. And that Saturday, Alex was in a soccer game. He was playing, he's goalie, he's white presenting. And there was a sweeper, the guy in front of him, who cleared the ball, who is Mexican, brown skinned. And someone on the other team yelled, "I hate Mexicans." And nobody heard it on the sidelines. But that night, Alex was telling us about the game at dinner. They had won. He was sharing all of the information. And he told us a story about how when Brian cleared it, someone on the other team yelled, "I hate Mexicans." And I was like, no. He was like, yeah. And I was like, so what did you say? What did you do? And he was like, it was no big deal, Mom. We're just here to play soccer. And Brian didn't care. And I was like, in my head, 500 things were going through my head. And I was like, what do you mean Brian didn't care? Like, what about you? You know, like, you're Mexican. And even if you're not Mexican, like, I was super devastated. I didn't say anything in the moment because I could tell that he was nervous even talking about it. But that night, Carlos and I had a long discussion, and I was like, this is not okay. Like, clearly I'm missing something as a mother. Like, I'm not raising my children the way I thought I was going to raise them. He's 12 already. I just seen this report. I'm failing as a mother, which took me into a tailspin. But where I came out of it was, it's really not that I can do that. Like, I can do things differently, but not necessarily to raise him differently. I needed to be different. So the difference was, instead of me figuring out how am I going to have more conversations at our dinner table about race, it became, what can I do to be the kind of person that I want to be, so that he has a role model, and that this isn't a foreign conversation, and that we're not having this like, okay, we should probably talk about race now. And I didn't really know how to do that, except that I committed. So that was the day I committed. So the one thing that I want to say is, when people are like, I don't know what to do, commit. Like, maybe it's a moment for you, but figure out when you felt the impact, when you were emotionally impacted by racism in a way that you've never been before, to that extent. And that's the day you commit, because once you commit, I promise you, you will continue to take action, and you'll mess up, but you'll continue. And part of that had to do with like me questioning how I was raised, and then me deciding how I wanted to raise my children differently. And in the gap between that was, who do I want to be differently? Like, who am I, and how do I want to be? And who are my friends? And what books am I reading? And what podcasts am I listening to? And what am I showing up for? Okay, I'm curious, and if we can use the chat for this, what kind of harmful messages did you get growing up? And when I talk about harmful messages, if I am talking specifically to white women, but I think male toxicity is very prevalent too. So if there are men on this call, what kind of messages did you get growing up that you think potentially impacts how you do or do not show up for conversations around race? And if you want me to explain that more, I can. But for example, I was told that I was pretty but dumb. So meaning, I can't really, how can I engage in intellectual conversations maybe? Or maybe I'm just eye candy for somebody, and I'm like, what point is there in even having a conversation? Or if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all. Like, so monitoring what comes out of your mouth and how valuable it is. What kind of messages? And I'm trying to see if I can even see where the chat is.
Sarah, are you talking more from family members or anybody?
Anybody, teachers, peers.
Did you want us to use the chat, or?
Yeah, I do want you to use the chat. I mean, you can speak out too, but I would love it to go in the chat so people can see. Oh, there's my chat. Okay. Yes. Please throw in the chat any kind of harmful messages you got growing up that would impact your ability to speak up. So if you're not engaged, everyone is the same, lots of messages of colorblindness, okay? I know one of them for me was, especially in business, don't talk about race, politics, religion. You're being raised by a white family, so you don't have to worry about it. Yes. You're pretty, but not college bound. I hear that, Janae. Racism is bad, and everyone who is racist is bad. Culture of niceness, Midwest nice. And so talking about someone based on their skin color isn't nice. Like, we're not even supposed to point it out when we see it, right? Like, ooh, don't notice that. Essentially, don't rock the boat. Yes. Don't question everything. Yes. How can we do it differently? And y'all are, because y'all saw that how you were raised is different than what you're doing now. So we know that there is movement, which is awesome, but you're here, so you want more. So let's do more. All right, what can we do differently? We can understand and seek different perspectives, which can be hard if your world is white. So that literally might be your challenge. What can I do so that I have a more diverse social network, or friends, or people that I am in projects with? Learn about your own strengths. Where do you shine? Where do you, like, are you an organizer? Are you, so that if instead of beating ourselves up all the time that we're not doing it well enough, we're not doing it enough, we're not doing it good enough, like there's so much not enoughness, to focus on our own strengths actually is going against the grain, because status quo wants us to focus on our weaknesses and wants us to be diminished. So if we can come out of that and actually be like, here's where I can take some ownership of what I'm really good at, and then get involved in those areas. So I don't have a lot of fear of making mistakes. Like, I think learning Spanish helped me a lot because I sounded terrible when I would speak Spanish, but I was so excited about being able to communicate with someone that I got over that, that need to be perfect, because I just never would sound perfect. So I don't mind having conversations and even talking in public about things that that makes me uncomfortable even. So that would be one of my strengths. So learn about your strengths and then really go after them. What can we do differently in terms of historical context? Historical context in terms of looking at our own history, looking at the history of our neighborhoods, looking at the history of, I don't know where you work, but within your career, if you're in education, what's the historical context? Yes, there's a lot of history that we missed growing up, but where can we be learning more history on a regular basis? Because there's so much that we can continue to gain from that. Inner work, acknowledging whiteness and privilege, that is constant. And it means having challenging conversations in the mirror with yourself. Relationship work and community work. So how are you building relationships with other people so that they're strong and that you can have challenging conversations? Acknowledging the impact of systems of oppression, being vocal about that, addressing institutional racism in the workplace, criminal justice system, healthcare, education, etc. So those are the things that we can be doing differently, and we can be engaging in effective conversations better. And part of the reason that we need to be learning how to engage in effective conversations is because conversations do lead to action. So a lot of times it's like, oh, it's just more talk, it's more talk. If we're watching our conversations and noticing how they change, so how did you have a conversation about race that was maybe heated or emotionally charged 3 years ago compared to now? So don't forget to look back and see how you've grown instead of consistently beating yourself up about it. Because if we're constantly creating more effective conversations, there will be shifts in change. It's slow sometimes, and that's frustrating, but it definitely happens. Okay, here's some conversation guidelines. This would be for within this hour that we're together, but also mostly it's for you to create a toolbox for yourself so that you are you can go back to it when you are having conversations with other people. So using I statements, once you start practicing this, I mean, this is just good for any kind of conversation, but to not be talking about a group, like, and I sometimes do this when I talk about white people, when really I need to be talking about myself as one white person, because I can't talk for a whole group of people. But to use I statements also when we're talking in a conversation and someone is arguing with us, if we say something like, well, this is my understanding, this is how I feel, this is what I think, you can't argue with how I feel. But if I'm saying, well, you do this, or you said this, or anything with the you and the your is outward and can be argued in a way that isn't necessarily effective. Being brief, can be helpful unless you are very brief and then maybe explaining more. So also this is where the self-awareness comes in terms of understanding how you show up on a regular basis, and then what is serving you and what isn't, and what is serving the conversation, what isn't. Resist the desire to interrupt. Be honest and willing to be vulnerable, which is really challenging sometimes. Pausing is a tool that I try and use more and more, and I still struggle with it. But when a conversation gets heated, to simply pause, the pregnant pause they call it, is really helpful. Try not to take things personally. Is that what this is? Sorry, I have to move this. Yeah. Listen with curiosity, suspend judgment, watch for detours, stay on topic, and expect and accept unfinished business. And this is what we talked about in the very beginning in terms of when you see a conversation trying to fix or make sense of it all, that is when we are stuck in this need to make it pretty and finish it. Like, we need to put it together before we can go on to the next conversation. When the reality is, even engaging in a conversation that doesn't end in any sort of results, that is positive movement. And that's not something that we're taught or used to, because normally the goal is that everyone has to agree. That's not always going to happen. Oh, I don't know what that is. Okay. So one of the things that I want you to think about right now is a conversation that you've had recently. Because when we have conversations that can get challenging, if we can know what the intention is and what our intention is, and specifically ask ourselves that before we go into the conversation. So there's 3 typical ways of being able to engage in a conversation around race specifically. One is as a bystander. So if you're part of a conversation, 2 people are talking and you're there, you're not like at a different table, you're within the conversation, but it's not you specifically speaking or receiving, you're considered the bystander. And there are definitely options for as a bystander to use your voice. And then the second one is if you're the speaker, so whether you're going to bring up a topic that might be difficult, or if you say something accidentally that might be offensive or racist. So as the speaker, how do you navigate that? And then as the receiver, how do you navigate that? So if you're intentionally going into a conversation where you want to bring up a hard topic, you have a moment where you can choose your intention. And the intention might be something like, I'm curious about what my uncle might say. I'm curious what my child might think about what we just experienced at the grocery store. So if you can have an intention, and to check yourself to make sure the intention isn't to prove somebody's wrong, to change them, because we can't change people, but to really think about why you want to have the conversation. Especially if you're talking with children, and if your intention is to teach them, I want you to question what you're teaching them. Because if we're learning with our children, and obviously this is very age specific, but children know so much more than we do sometimes. They are not dumb. They see, they hear, they can sense our anxiety. Like, they're brilliant little human beings. So when we come in with this authoritarian, or even oh my gosh, can you hear my 15-year-old playing games in the background, like screaming downstairs? No, it's not distracting you at all? Okay. Good. If it's not distracting you, I can tune it out. So this whole concept of we know best and now it's our job to teach you. I think, me personally, you're going to hear different things from different people, that's not effective when we're having conversations around race, because we're learning just as much as they are. That's my opinion. Also, you know your child best. But that's the third point. Does anyone want to jump in and have that conversation about what it's like having conversation, and we do have to specify the ages, because ages change the whole conversation. So if we're talking about older children, like 10 years old and plus, I think that there's more opportunity for a child to shut down and not engage if they feel like they're being talked to versus talked with. And part of the goal around having more conversations about race and whiteness and white privilege within families is to open space so that we can make mistakes, so that we can say the wrong thing and learn about it with someone who knows our heart. Versus if I say something wrong, my mom is going to be mad at me and yell at me, so I don't want to say anything. And part of that is modeling, which is the modeling that I don't know, that's a good question. Let's learn together. Let's find out. What do you think? What comes up for you? So that's like being curious versus being in judgment. I'm going to go back to number 2. And again, if you do want to, I just opened the door for people to jump in. If they want to jump in, again, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. So who am I talking to and what are the power dynamics? I think when we talk about like, here are your tips and tools for having effective conversations, number 1 is, what is the power dynamics? Because this is where your critical thinking skills, like, you know, if you're talking to a colleague, it's very different than if you're talking to your boss versus your client. So we have to use different skills based on who we're talking to and what's on the line. So if you are nervous about having conversations in the workplace because you're worried about getting fired, which tends to be a number of people who are people of color, they want to avoid conversations because they don't want to rock the boat because their job might be on the line, right? So in my case as a white person, I'm gonna think differently and more critically about what can I risk and what is meaningful for me to risk based on my privilege and what can serve most, right? So like, I am less likely to get fired. I'm also the boss of my own business. So like, understanding my power dynamics within that and knowing that someone might not want to bring something to the table, I have to be very conscientious about how things are delivered. And I've heard this come up a lot when people shame other people for not bringing something up. That's not helpful. First of all, we don't do shame and blame and guilt. Like it doesn't serve anybody. And if somebody chooses not to speak up at a certain moment, that doesn't mean that they're not doing the work, because a lot of it might be, okay, what can I learn from that? Where do we go from here? Versus looking at what could have been and what I wish I would have done or what that person should or shouldn't have done. What do I have control over and where can I go from here based on whatever it was that happened? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. What tools do I have access to? So this is you just going through your list of, all right, how do I need to maintain my cool in this conversation? Thinking a little bit in advance of, okay, I could use a pause. I could name it. So if I'm uncomfortable and I'm having a conversation with my sister that I've been really wanting to have for a long time, but I'm nervous about it, I could just tell her. What if I were to tell her, I'm really nervous about having this conversation? And I might get a little flushed and my heart is beating fast. So this is us being vulnerable. So that's practicing vulnerability and naming how we actually feel versus feeling like we have to have it all together to have a conversation, which we don't. And how do I end it? So have some of these things in your pocket in terms of, a lot of times people end with, oh, well, let's just agree to disagree. This one really bothered me because there were a couple of times I used it and I didn't feel in alignment afterwards. And I talked to someone about it because it was really bothering me. And she was so brilliant. She was like, why don't you agree that you disagree, but don't agree to disagree? So you can say, yeah, we disagree, but I feel so strongly about this. So I know you don't, or you don't think the same way as me, but we can end this conversation with me just being very clear that this is where I stand on this. Because sometimes agreeing to disagree is like, okay, maybe you're right, maybe I'm right, and I'm not trying to be right or wrong. I'm just telling you right now that I feel really strongly about this, and we are disagreeing. But that was more in alignment for me, and because I felt like I was just giving up by saying, oh, I guess we'll just agree to disagree, and you can go along your merry way. I wanted the person to know I was upset. I was upset that they couldn't see where I was coming from, which is their prerogative. But these are some ways of how do we end a conversation that gets challenging. One of them might just be like, hey, I'm really upset, you're upset, I don't think this is going anywhere, but it's important to me, so can we circle back if it's worth it to circle back? So these are things where you do your critical thinking. You know if it's going to be an effective conversation or not, and then you decide how you're going to navigate your own energy output. So what do you have capacity for and what don't you have capacity for? And is it a good use of your energy? Because if you say, I have to do all of this and I have to engage in every single challenging conversation ever because otherwise I'm a bad white person, that's not realistic. Okay, I'm just gonna pause for a second because I see some chats. I definitely feel like I have to have it all together to have a conversation. Oh my gosh, yes, I do too. And it is very liberating to be like, I don't know all the answers. This is what I think. I'm still learning. And yes, my son is 9 and he asked why there were signs in our neighborhood that say Black Lives Matter. It was hard to even begin how to explain the purpose or meaning of the signs. His comment was, well, Mom, don't all lives matter? I did my best to explain, yet I would have loved to have had another resource to educate him, and I also didn't know how much I should explain at his age level. He has friends that are Black or biracial, so he was confused and didn't understand. Okay, beautiful. First, you wish that you would have, where did it say that? I would have loved to have had another resource. The coolest thing about being a parent is that we have our whole lives with these children. So like, there are so many missed conversations I've had, but we can go back. And sometimes I've tried to have conversations when they weren't open to it anyway. So and there are signs all over the place. So you can bring this up again whenever you want. What do you wish you would have said now that you've had time to think about it? Are you saying that you still aren't sure what you would have said differently, or help me out?
Well, it's like, how far back do I go with explaining racism? And like, I guess he wasn't aware of racism because he has friends that are biracial or Black or of culture, and he just, like, he didn't get it. He didn't understand. He was like, what do you mean some people are mean to them? Like, he just, I don't know, he didn't understand. And then I was like, oh gosh, where do I even begin with this one, you know?
So I think it's helpful to remember that we can ask them questions. So do you notice that people are treated differently based on skin color?
That's a good one.
Or what do you notice? Like, what's different about you and your life and what you have access to with white skin than people that you know that aren't white, that are Black or brown, and see what he says. And because part of it is gauging where they're at, but sometimes when we put two, like I was always taught to just answer the one question that they ask, because I tend to like throw on 10 more paragraphs and then I lose them. So don't all lives matter? So if that's the question, what's the answer? Which is, of course.
Yeah. And I was shocked. I was like, where did he hear that from? I'm like, have you been listening to the news, or,
yeah, you could even ask that question. Like, so you can engage in the conversation further by continuing to ask questions, but then to be very clear that not everyone is treated the same because of the color of their skin, and the world isn't fair, and systems are, there is racism. So racism exists. What do you know about racism? What have you heard about it? What have you experienced? Is that helpful?
Yes, thanks. And it sounds like I had a similar conversation. It was just, you know, how I just didn't know if I should go way back and start going through like history with slavery. And, but you're right, too much information, I think I would lose them.
Yeah. And these are the times, this is where I like to go back to that if you're learning about history, if you're watching movies, if you're reading, and if there are books on the table, then you're having conversations at the table, maybe about like, oh my gosh, I watched this powerful movie yesterday. So what you're talking about in terms of sharing about your life and your understanding of historical context, that's, I think, a really brilliant way of having children learn or be interested in, wait, what's mom learning about? Why is she interested in this? Like, I'm maybe curious, and maybe as a child they could care less, but it is hard to teach them in some of these moments where, and I think we take on this responsibility of it's our job to teach them so much, where if we look at it as, oh my gosh, here's an amazing opportunity for me to engage in a conversation, and he trusts me to have this conversation. So how can I be authentic with him? And it sounds like you did that. And you're going to continue to do it. Like, it's not a one and done. It's not like you had that moment and now there no other moments will come up. Because you could even come up later and be like, oh my gosh, I was thinking about what you said the other day and XYZ. Or I heard my friend talking about, you know, the sign that she has in her yard and whatever. So there are different ways to bring it up. Okay, I'm going to go back to my, how do I end it? Are there other tips on how to end it? Sometimes the conversations get derailed. So like maybe we're talking about police brutality, but someone wants to talk about black on black crime. And that's like this typical derail of a conversation. So if you have an intention and your intention is, I want to actually hear more about what this person thinks about police brutality, because I've heard them, you know, because maybe they have a sign in their yard that says Blue Lives Matter. And so maybe out of curiosity, you're going to interact with a friend and ask this question. So check yourself on what your intention is, because sometimes just understanding how people think is a brilliant way of learning in general and learning to engage in conversations that are challenging. And then if it does get heated and sometimes it's easier to derail, it's helpful if we're going to have effective conversations to bring it back. So, okay, I notice we're talking about black on black crime right now, but like actually what I was wondering about is police brutality or the systems of policing in general. And I'm curious about, like, this is my understanding, but so how do you bring it back and then be like, again, there might not be a simple answer to this, but I really appreciated learning more about what you think. Or I really appreciated hearing myself try and explain in a jumbled way what I think, because we can think brilliantly, but when we speak sometimes it doesn't always come out the same. And the more we practice speaking it out loud, the more we can actually relate to how we actually think. I've seen this happen with my children, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying. Building relationships on trust and respect is huge. So if we're having, and this is again when we talk about power dynamics and who are we talking to, if we trust someone and we respect them, it's a lot easier to make sure that people have space for what they need to say and to be heard, because we have a long relationship. Like we anticipate a longer, like talking to them in years to come. So there are different ways to manage that, and it makes it a lot easier. Here are some tools and resources that I'm going to share. So there's a link, I'll put it in the chat in a second. There's a Messy Conversations workbook that you can download for free. And there's a 7 conversations, topics, and guided questions. So I wrote this for teenagers, specifically parents and teenagers, but you can use it with anybody. And I know one of the questions about like how young is too young, or how old is too young, et cetera, for having conversations with children. Personally, my opinion is that if people of color are having conversations when they're 2-3 years old, I don't see why whiteness isn't talked about when we're 2 and 3 and 4 years old. So whiteness is the norm in a lot of places. And if we can name that and start acknowledging that, then our children are better set up to live in a more diverse world when they can actually see it and they're not caught off guard by it. So I personally don't think that there is a too young, but again, you know your children well and you can manage that. So the 7 conversation topics and guided questions, there is one topic and then there are specific questions, and you can either share that with someone and then you guys have an intentional conversation, or you can just randomly bring it up with someone. You can have all 7 with the same person, or you can have 7 different conversations with 7 different people. But to practice having challenging conversations, you need to put it on your calendar and you need to hold yourself accountable. So I also highly recommend actually finding an accountability partner and making that happen. Practice, celebrate, acknowledge. Celebrate your mistakes. Okay, you're gonna make mistakes. So it's kind of like this concept of, we don't expect our kids to tie, the first time they're tying their shoe, they're not gonna tie it perfectly. Like, it would be weird if they could perfectly tie their shoes when they're first learning how. So making mistakes is part of the gig. And if we can acknowledge the fact that we do more harm by not speaking out than we do by making a mistake that we have the potential to repair, then when we make a mistake, now we are going to be creating an opportunity for ourselves to build racial resiliency. Racial resiliency is not something we're raised with, and it's painful because nobody wants to be seen as a racist. But when we make mistakes, we can repair them. And sometimes that repair actually strengthens the relationship and it strengthens ourselves. So if you think about when you rip a piece of clothing and then you sew it, where you sewed it up is actually tighter than it was before it was ripped. And this is in any relationship. When something bad happens, usually you'll see the relationship either deepens and grows and expands, or it dissipates and kind of goes away. Like when you get into a fight with someone, it's either going to blow it up and the relationship has the opportunity to improve or to just die out. I think it's really important to give ourselves some grace around that. And there's a local organization called Families for Justice. Kristen, okay, I'm interrupting this to read what Kristen says. My daughter is 5. We eat up books from the library. She comes to protests and gathering with us, and we moved to Madison from Monona so she would be in a diverse school. We have open conversations about race. She is in a social justice book club for kids. There is not always a lot of back and forth in the conversations we have, and sometimes there isn't even obvious interest on her part, but it so gets in. I overheard her say, "Did you know Black Lives Matter?" with her 2 little friends the other day. She will come to me and talk about Joe Biden and Donald Trump and their differences. She's 5. It's very cool to watch your kid grow up. One of my concerns is this with our daughter is overwhelming, or if this is overwhelming or scaring her. So I love hearing ideas on age appropriateness of things. Does she seem scared, Kristen? Oh wait, you're still muted, I think.
I think the fear, can you hear me now?
Yes.
The fear thing, I get a lot of books from the library on social justice issues, and sometimes, we'll start reading them and I'm like, whoa, I should have looked at this one beforehand. And it's just heavy stuff, like the police brutality stuff. And these were told to me to be for 5-year-olds, right? But so I guess I don't know. And she's a pretty sensitive kid and she thinks really deeply about things. So I just want to caution that I'm not scaring her, I don't know if how to say it any differently than that. But I also, you don't want to sugarcoat life, and I want her to understand the details.
Yeah. So the information might be frightening because that's the reality, but it sounds like, is in a very safe and loving home. So her sense of safety is the most important thing. And if she's consistently feeling safe and loved, the fear is something that then she has space to talk to you about. But you'll notice too, if she's having nightmares, or if, like, what I think videos can have a impact on children, like in their brains. So I do, and I'm not a child psychiatrist, so like I'm not that kind of expert at all, but I've heard that I have been more cautious with videos with children than anything else. But the world is painful and it's brutal, and how we manage pain and how we interact with pain and grief and fear is not normal. It's not normally we're not socialized to interact with feelings that some people call negative feelings. They're not negative. Like, our emotions tell us something. So I think being able to have even conversations about fear is helpful. Like, that's what we want for our kids. Mm-hmm. And maybe ask her, are you scared? Mm-hmm. Is this overwhelming for you? Can I keep talking about this, or do you want me to stop? And then we need to trust them. I think we really need to trust what they say, because we make up a lot of stories on behalf of our children. When if we can learn to trust them, and they see that we do trust them, and then follow through on that trust. Like, if we say, are you scared? And then they say no, and then we say, oh, but this is really scary. Like, we're putting on them, well, you should be scared. We're not necessarily listening. So that's my, and if anyone else has any other feedback, but that's what my intuitive hit on it is on.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's another question about how to bring up these topics in an age-appropriate way. I think part of it is how we talk about anything in an age-appropriate way is, there are times when, if there's a hurricane or there's a scary storm that's happening, that's a system of weather, right? And so there's systems of oppression, and they are impacting people that we love. So to not talk about it because we're worried about our kids, I don't know how helpful that is. So I'm big on, let's have conversations and make sure that our kids know that they're safe, which that's our main job anyway, is to keep them safe. I hope that's helpful. Okay, I'm gonna go back to this slide here. When I talk about humility, I think this is really important, because we need to come to this conversation with humility, which is the absence of ego, righteousness, arrogance, and the need for right, wrong. And it's so easy to get righteous, especially when we're talking politics and we're talking Biden versus Trump. And it's so easy to talk about right versus wrong. And that's not coming to the table with humility. So I'm constantly checking myself, because I believe in humanity and love, right? So even though it's really, really hard, that's what I would like to model for my children. And that means loving people that I don't agree with, and not making people wrong because I'm right and they're wrong. That's not where I want to come from. So when I teach and when I talk about it, I'm always looking for ways to take out that righteousness. And that's why we don't do shame, blame, and guilt. And my kids love to shame, blame, and guilt, and point fingers and who's at fault. And this person is bad, because it simplifies it all. And I always go back to, it's complicated. And it's okay that it's complicated, but it is complicated. And this is where I'm at with it. I just want to know that I want you all to have access to that as you move through challenging conversations. Also, as part of your inner work, how do you handle conflict? So you also know, if you come to the table and there's conflict, do you get angry, aggressive? Do you raise your voice? Do you get defensive? And you'll notice defensive is twice here, because defensive also shows up in nervousness and anxiety and righteousness. Do you freeze? Do you shut down? Do you get quiet? Do you change the subject, make a joke, or diminish? So if you notice those, if you take the time, not right now, but at some point, if you take the time and you think about the last 3 conversations that you got into that ended in conflict or started in conflict or somehow had conflict into it, how did you show up? And then what do you want to shift next time? So that you're changing how you behave. You're not asking someone else to change, but you're acknowledging, you're taking ownership for how you behave, and then you can shift it. And then if you do get defensive the next time, because I get defensive when I get anxious, I also get flushed. So like I can physically feel myself when a conversation is heated, and it helps me because then I can say, okay, I'm feeling a little, I'm feeling heated right now. So I'm just going to try and take a breath. I'm not trying to hide anything. Like I'm not trying, like I can have a really intellectually brilliant conversation and be heated and have my heart beating at the same time. Like it's not like I have to, like this is the conversation, or like you don't have to have it all together. Defensiveness, I also have learned to say, I've only done this like twice, so I'm not saying that, but I'm getting defensive and that's not serving me right now. So I've literally stopped myself in a conversation like, I'm sorry, I hear myself getting defensive and that's not serving the conversation. So I just need to take a pause. Defensiveness is the first, it's just an easy one to go to. Okay. I love these chats that are coming up that we can just jump in and out of. So Leah says, I can relate to that. I shakily told my 7-year-old stepdaughter pretty straightforwardly that a police officer who was white killed George Floyd, who was black, when she asked about why the protests in Madison, and she paused and had some tears, as did I, and was like, but the police are supposed to protect people. And then she comes up with these ideas about how she wouldn't kill people if she was a police officer. And then I kind of get stuck because yes, and many didn't sign up to protect Black people. And then it's just so hard to know where to go from there. I get stuck in her questions about why some white people hate Black people. And it's so much deeper than that. I guess we're slowly getting there, but it is hard. Yeah. So Leah, you're sitting in it with her. Like, and you want to have the answers to everything, but if we had the answers, we wouldn't be in this, we wouldn't still be here. So it's literally just holding each other's hands in this darkness and being like, yeah. And to take it, so like, and if you are coming from the framework of racial justice, it isn't about people hurting people as much as it is systems hurting people. So police officers are trained in systems. Oh, I'm sorry, there's more. No, Leah, it's awesome. We're totally where we're supposed to be all the time. So understanding that the system was created, and yes, slavery still exists today through different ways, and that's what we're trying to unhook from. So if our kids are looking for hope, then where do we have hope? So I know that I'm not going to tell this long story, but there are people who are looking at different ways for, so like instead of us calling the police to do a welfare check on someone, what if we were to call a different number? Or what if we called 911 and instead of them sending the police, they would send the EMT? So like, and I know I have older children, so this might be hard for 7-year-olds, but to even start to think about when our children start to talk about, and when we start to talk about individuals hurting people, how do we take it a little bit bigger and show them that there's a system in play and that people are good. Like there is humanity in every single human being. And then if they're like, well, what are you talking about? The education is a system, right? So you have a teacher, but then, yeah, you probably can't have that conversation with a 7-year-old. Never mind. But maybe you can and they won't get it right now, but they'll get it later, right? I mean, that happens too. So Sandra said, also catching the other person who are having the conversation with how they are reacting and pausing and asking them why. Made a joke or changed the subject helps with the conversation if they can feel comfortable telling you. Yes. So what I think you're saying is if someone else makes a joke or changes the subject, how do we bring it back in a loving way so that they don't feel attacked or feel like you're shaming them for doing that? If I'm hearing correctly, Sandra.
And a lot of it could be they just are uncomfortable and you're comfortable having that conversation. So when they change that subject, you know that something shifted for them to do that. So coming back and saying, hey, can I ask why you just kind of switched the subject or made a joke there? And they'll be like, well, I feel like we're getting a little heated, or they kind of explain why. And it's like, okay, well, is it something I said that I can explain better? And you kind of then the whole conversation reopens in a different way and light, and it kind of helps
Yes.
that.
Yes. I love that. Thank you. Because really it's about the interaction with somebody. And so seeing that and being so kind to open it back up, that's awesome. And you can do that. Breathing, slowing down, naming it, like I already said, I'm feeling uncomfortable, naming it, or I'm feeling defensive, or I'm getting really angry, pausing and agreeing to talk later. Those are some of the tools that you can use. And we can send these slides out later if they're helpful. It's 7:35 and I do really want to give you some, but I feel like we've been doing the questions as we go. So I'm not going to be too hard on this about the time, but where is the work? Okay, this is super important from my framework. This is a circle. It's kind of a circle, but it's circular. This is not linear. So like the awareness, a lot of times people are like, oh, first you become aware, like I did when I listened to that Race to Equity report and I had this burst of awareness. And my first reaction after my awareness was to go into action. Like I was like, we need to do something. We need to fix this. I skipped analysis. And this is very typical in this white culture of productivity and fixing and doing. So I'm going to remind people to go to analysis first. And sometimes that literally means 6 months of not taking action because your action is in learning. So if you want to read a bunch of books, or if you want to listen to a number of podcasts or go to some seminars, etc., to be in analysis is a really important place to be before we jump into action. At the same time, there are people who have analysis paralysis. So again, there's the reason why the inner work is so important is you have to know yourself and to know where your pitfalls are and where your strengths are. So moving through awareness, analysis, action, you might be in action and all of a sudden get a new awareness. So you're right back at awareness. Like this is why this is not linear. And you might be in action and realize you want to do some more analysis around a different topic, or something comes up and you're like, ooh, I need to learn more about this. And accountability, this is how we get in community and share and get vulnerable and get checked. So who are we accountable to? Are we accountable to the movement? Are we accountable to ourselves? Are we accountable to somebody that is also doing the work with us? Who do we call when we make a mistake, and who talks us through it? And does the person who's talking us through it, are they doing the work in a way that you are in alignment with, or are you calling someone who's going to tell you it's okay, you're a good white person, and tell you what you want to hear versus what you might need to hear? So these are some things I want you to think about, and to cut, and just to always be circling through it, or noticing where you are, and don't get stuck in one of them, and give yourself space for all of it. I actually made myself a little Post-it note of that. So, because it's helpful for me to remember, and I encourage you to remember that too, because a lot of times we think we should be in action all the time. So what we talked about today, the unique position of being a white woman, what stops us from doing the work, which are a lot of the messaging that we get, understanding what the work is and learning about the process. And just, I don't know, it depends on who you are, but I'm someone who's more lean towards being a rebel more. So when I realize that I am in status quo, it encourages me to do something different because I don't want to fall into status quo. So if my silence is maybe complicit, then I'm like, okay, I don't want to be part of the oppressive system. So I'm going to try and break through. So whatever are your trickster moves to get you out of your comfort zone and pushing that level of growth edge, hang on to that and make yourself a little note so that you can keep going back to it. All right, what's next? Donating money, always. So knowing what the Black-led organizations are, getting the work on your calendar, because if it's on your calendar, you're committed to it. If you want to do the 7x7 challenge, which is 7 conversations, 7 people, 7 weeks, you could do 7 conversations with one person in 4 months. Like, we just make this stuff up so that it's fun for you to actually have something to focus on and be held accountable for. Your resources and toolbox, write it down, do the work. The work means writing things down and following through on them and having an accountability partner. You can do that right now. You can think for a minute about who would be your person that you would call when you want to make sure that you're staying challenged, and who is your accountability. So it might even just be like, okay, I really do want to finish reading this book and I don't want to join another book club. So I need to tell my friend and check in and have it be that I check in with them once a week to figure out where I'm at with the progress. Does anyone have any questions or conversations that you want to practice about?
I just want to say, I think the hard part for me is I have young kids. I have a 6 and a 4-year-old, if you can't hear them in the background right now. But is letting them know that, like we were saying, the difference in the big picture versus the little, like they continue to hear about police brutality, so they think all police are bad. But I've had police people and like police professionals in my family, and so teaching them that they're not all bad. It's just without saying it, but how do you say it without saying, I guess what I say is they were taught, and I don't want to say wrong, but the system has taught them wrong, but they don't understand that. So how do you explain that to a 6-year-old to know that police aren't bad? They're not bad people. They just, some of them go to the extreme, but they shouldn't. I don't know. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah. So sometimes there are kids on the playground that we don't want to play with. We just have a feeling, we have a preference, etc., or we don't feel safe. And who knows what that child, what their life is like. Maybe they have a parent that hurts them, or, hurt people. So I think that there's a way of explaining that it's unfortunate that the police system isn't working the way we hoped it would. Like, I think we all kind of hoped that to protect and to serve would be to protect and to serve all. But that's not how it's working now. And we're hoping to change that. And like you said, watching our language around talking about specifics, because I don't even believe in the good apples versus bad apples, right? Like that doesn't resonate for me when I look at systemic racism in the police world or in any of the institutional world. So I think it's not working how I would want it to work. It actually is working how it was made to work. I mean, if we look at the history of policing, it was to keep Black people in with their plantations. So is that helpful? And it could even be, it's complicated and we're going to keep talking about it. And at some point it's going to click for you. And right now it might not. The can of worms is that.
Yeah.
Teachers, I mean, we've had teachers that we don't get along with, and that, but also safety, like when people are, safety is a thing. So I have a 15-year-old who hates the police, and I'm not going to tell him not to. It's not how I want him to grow up. I would want him to feel safe calling the police, but he doesn't. And so my job, I think, is to hold space for that and to be there for him. And young kiddos, which part are you talking about, explaining to young kiddos why some people hate the police?
Yeah. So more, it's like, explain that bad things happen. And, they hear my husband and I talk about fair amount. And they, like you said, they're resilient. They're listening all the time. So letting them know it's safe to call the police if you need help, or they're the ones you may need to go to for help. But then them coming back and saying, but they do harm to people. It's kind of like, yes, but, it's, you get in that bubble of, yes, some do, but.
And yes, sometimes I'm comfortable calling the police, and yes, sometimes I'm not. And so, like, when do we call the police? Like, if the house is on fire, we would call 911. And then it's even changing it's calling 911 versus calling the police. But I think having conversations about when do we call 911 is helpful. And then to keep it simple like that, to simplify. Yeah, there are times when I'm not going to call the police. If I'm having an interaction maybe with a person of color, I might not call the police. And if I'm feeling like not safe, I am probably going to call 911. Or if someone breaks into my house, I'm going to call 911. Leah, I see you. Sorry, the systemic piece, it just means lots and lots of conversations. Yes. Does anyone else want to throw anything out there that has been challenging for them in talking to the kiddos? Or talking to your spouse or anything? We have it's 7:45, but if anyone has one more, we can.
I'm the grandmother on the call.
Hi, Grandma.
And my whole life has been social work, social justice and whatever. And I've worked with all generations. And the one mistake is that we talk too much, and our actions speak louder than any word that any of you can say. When you are in a grocery store and you're helping, like an example, here's an example. When my children were little, we went to Woodman's every Friday night, and it was a store in which there's lots of diversity. People were, shopping, and they didn't understand. A lot of them, were not really English speakers very well. And so I would, when they'd be looking at something, and I'd ask them if I could help them. And my children were humiliated. Mother, you walked right up to that person, But it proved to be the thing to do, because now my children do the same thing. So it's just all of you on this call are exemplary, because you are letting your children know that you want to improve the world. And this is your baby step to help them. So I guess, and the other thing about all of this is it isn't always color too. It's diversity in terms of age too. Because I noticed that more as an older individual. If you're past a certain age, you're not worth anything. I have twin granddaughters, and they're almost 10 years old, and their whole lives, it's baby steps. It's like I have 3 pumpkins, and I said to them, this ugly thing in the middle, doesn't it make that arrangement look pretty? And what you think about the interaction on the playground, because it's not just the police, it's the playground assistant is not equipped to handle the bullying. And my granddaughters are very social justice conscious, and one of them is a real advocate about it. And she kind of makes a scene about it. She went and told the playground person that this individual was bullying the other. Well, the playground person didn't know what to do with her, so she just put her off. So then the granddaughter went and told the teacher. Well, I can't get involved with that because I wasn't out there. So see, they see in their little minds, at whatever age they are, there are scenarios in their little world that we can use as example and teachable moments.
Mhm.
So I encourage all of you to do that, because I think sometimes, and I know that there's a variety of ages that your children are on this call, but see, I'm 75 and I'm still trying to learn. So it's an ongoing life adventure in how to do that. But it's not just color, it's everything.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And also, like, when we make mistakes, it's so important for our kids to hear us say, I wish I wouldn't have said this, or I made a mistake. I hurt my intent versus my impact. Intent and impact is so helpful for conversations with kids, because I used to have a kid, I'll tell this one story, and then I know I'm past my time already, Brittany, but he would like accidentally throw his arm around in the playground and like hit someone, and the person would cry because he was hit, and then my son would not stop crying because he was so upset that he hurt somebody, right? So like, he didn't mean it, but the impact was there. And yet this is where we get into the white centering too, where like, now we're going to spend so much time trying to console my son who created harm but didn't mean to. And so like, that's a great example of how we can bring it to their level of like, see, remember this is like, you didn't mean it, but it still hurt, and it really hurt that other person. Okay, intent versus impact. Yes, let's practice that. Okay, thank you all so much. I could talk for too much. Like she said, I talk too much with my children too. Brittany, do you have anything you want to jump in? Brittany is here from Wanakee Public Library.
I just wanted to thank everybody really quickly for coming. I think it's amazing that you all showed up and were willing to have this conversation and listen to Sara. And if there's ever anything at all that we can do at the library to support you and your family in any way, I mean, always reach out. We're more than willing to try and help. And a huge, huge, huge thank you to Sara for agreeing to do this. I really, really appreciate it. And I feel like I've learned a lot and have a lot to reflect on, and will think about this for a really long time. So thank you so much for everything that you do and that are doing. This was really, truly wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yes. Yeah. And again, we all are doing the work. And so let's not be so hard on ourselves and keep going. Brittany, is it possible or do you already have a curated list of books that would be good for different age kids?
Yeah, we started it at the beginning of the summer on the library website. There's a new section called I'm going to mess it up now. It's like Black Voices, Black Lives, or Black Stories, Black Lives, something like that. I should really know that, but it's all on our website. Okay. And there's different book lists and resources and websites to look at, with trusted sources for books for parents, for grown-ups, for kids of all ages. Some of them are ones that we've just kind of borrowed because we thought they were really well done. There's a couple on there that we put together ourselves of things that will link directly into the library catalog, so you can put things on hold if that's helpful. And then, like I said, you can always just contact us if you still need help. I know our adult services librarian has been partnering with a couple committees in Wanakee and doing some more adult specific programs, not necessarily just for parents, but any adult. So there's definitely more resources out there if you want to keep the conversation going.
Yes, thank you. And then my website also has resources too. I put it in the chat, and if you ever have any random questions or whatever, I'm easy to find, and you can email me, and I'll put my email. Well, you'll get my contact. We'll do an email out so you can have more contact information. But yep, I'm around. Everyone's around. Everyone wants to help everyone so that we can all be in this together. Thank you. We're out. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye.
Bye.